confirmation from our very own Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, who's in the Far East at the moment, that Diana, Princess of Wales, has in fact been in that car accident.
There is a place in England that almost everyone in the world knows exists, yet almost no one will ever see with their own eyes. It sits on a small private island deep within the Althorpe estate in Northamptonshire. A quiet, green, tree-covered piece of ground enclosed on all sides by the still waters of an ornamental lake known as the Round Oval. No public bridge leads to it. No path connects it to the shore. You can only reach it by boat, and only if someone who holds authority over that water decides to bring you there. For 27 years, that island carried the most private, the most protected, and the most emotionally significant grave in the entire world. It is where Diana Frances Spencer, the Princess of Wales, the most photographed woman of her generation, and one of the most beloved human beings of the 20th century, was laid to rest on September 6, 1997, 6 days after the car crash in the Pont El Alma tunnel in Paris took her life and shattered the hearts of hundreds of millions of people across every corner of the globe. She was 36 years old when she died, at the height of her influence, in the middle of building a life on her own terms for the first time. And for 27 years, the island at Althorpe held her in the kind of silence that her life inside the royal institution had almost never permitted. No cameras, no headlines, no crowds pressing against barriers to catch a glimpse. Just water and trees, and the quiet that her brother Charles Spencer had chosen deliberately when he decided this island, and not the Spencer family vault at the nearby Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Great Britain, would be her resting place. It was a decision made with protection in mind. An island surrounded by water is unreachable without permission, and permission, from the moment Diana was buried there, was something the Spencer family gave to no one. Diana had spent her entire public life being pursued. From the moment she was identified as the young woman who would marry the Prince of Wales, she became one of the most relentlessly observed people on the planet. Cameras followed her through her engagement, her wedding, her pregnancies, her charity work, her marriage breakdown, her divorce. There was no ordinary moment in her public existence that was not photographed, interpreted, and distributed to a global audience hungry for every detail of her life. In death, her family gave her the one thing that life had so rarely offered: genuine, enforced, absolute privacy. The island at Althorpe was that privacy made physical. But 27 years is a long time, and the same natural forces that work on every buried thing, water, ground movement, seasonal pressure, the slow and patient deterioration that time applies to all constructed spaces, had been working quietly on that burial chamber since the autumn of 1997. Earl Spencer, the hereditary owner of the Althorpe estate and Diana's younger brother, had taken his responsibilities as custodian of the site seriously across those decades. At some point in the years preceding the tomb's opening, he commissioned a formal structural engineering assessment of the burial chamber and the ground conditions surrounding the island. The surveyors who conducted that assessment returned findings that were not catastrophic, but were serious. Water infiltration, ground shift, and the accumulated effects of nearly 3 decades of exposure to the English climate had reached a threshold where intervention was no longer optional. The structure needed attention. The chamber needed to be accessed. British law added weight to that conclusion. The legal framework governing private burials on ancestral estates includes provisions for periodic review, with formal obligations that attach to burial sites after defined time intervals. The 27-year mark was not arbitrary. It coincided with specific legal requirements tied to private estate burial conditions, requirements that exist to ensure that private graves across the country remain properly maintained and do not deteriorate into problems for the land and families responsible for them. Compliance with those requirements gave additional formal justification for what was already structurally necessary. And then there was the human dimension, the reason that mattered most to the people most directly affected. Diana's sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, had reportedly expressed a personal and sincere desire to know that their mother's resting place was intact. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London while the world watched. Harry was 12. they had carried that day and everything it represented through every year of their public and private lives since. The possibility that the place holding their mother had been quietly compromised by water or structural decay, that she did not rest in the condition and dignity she deserved, was something neither of them could leave unaddressed once the engineering findings placed it on the table. So the decision was made, and the morning it was carried out, the Althorpe estate was closed to visitors. Staff across the wider grounds were kept largely unaware of what was happening. A small, carefully selected team arrived before dawn: structural engineers, preservation professionals, specialists in the careful handling of historic burial sites. Security was arranged with a kind of thoroughness that reflected the significance of what was being undertaken. The press received no advance notice. The whole operation was designed to proceed in the same spirit of privacy that had defined the site for 27 years. Earl Spencer was present throughout. His position as custodian of Althorpe and guardian of his sister's memory made his attendance both a right and a responsibility that he would not have delegated to anyone. The question of whether William and Harry were physically present is one that different sources answer slightly differently. It is broadly understood that William was at the estate during some portion of the process. Harry, living now in California with his wife and children, may have participated through a secure remote connection, not a lesser form of presence, but the practical reality of a family whose geography had changed, joined together across distance by an occasion that made geography irrelevant. The team worked with deliberate, unhurried care. Every stage was formally documented. Engineers recorded detailed structural notes. The progression of the work was captured for the historical record. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was treated as routine. When the burial chamber came into view for the first time since 1997, the people present, regardless of the professional roles that had brought them there, fell briefly and instinctively silent. There are moments that require no instruction to observe with reverence, and standing at the opened burial chamber of Princess Diana, 27 years after the world had said goodbye to her, was unquestionably one of them. The structural findings, when they came, brought genuine relief. The most serious fears had not materialized. The protective measures put in place at the time of Diana's burial had performed far better than the preliminary assessment had suggested they might. Her coffin, crafted from English elm, remained intact. The burial chamber, while carrying the natural marks of time and exposure, had held together with a solidity that surprised and reassured everyone present. The care taken in September 1997, in the immediate aftermath of a death that had shocked the world and demanded that everything be done right and quickly, had honored her as intended. For those standing there, that was not a small thing. It was a profound confirmation. But the structural inspection was not the whole story, not even close. Because as the team worked through their systematic review of the chamber's condition, they found something that had never appeared on any original documentation from the 1997 funeral. Alongside the known mementos and personal items that had been formally placed with Diana at the time of her burial, there were additional objects. Items that carried no official record. Items that had either been placed there during the burial itself or introduced at some carefully arranged later moment. The precise timing remains unclear. What was immediately clear to everyone present was that these items had been placed with full deliberation, and that they had been waiting in silence for exactly this kind of moment. Among them were sealed envelopes, letters written in Diana's own handwriting, addressed to specific people, prepared before her death and placed in a location she trusted, with the apparent understanding, or at least the deliberate preparation for the possibility, that the tomb would one day be opened and her words would be received by the people she had written them for. The existence of those letters changes the nature of everything. Diana was not a passive figure in the final years of her life. She was someone who thought about the future with clarity and intention, who understood that her absence would create specific challenges for specific people she loved, and who chose to address those challenges directly in writing placed somewhere protected, for delivery at a moment she could not predict, but chose to prepare for anyway. That is not the act of someone who believed her story was finished. It is the act of someone who understood that her story would continue long after her death, and who intended to have a voice in how it unfolded. The letter written to Prince William spoke to the future that awaited him. From the day he was born on June 21, 1982, the weight of the crown was already part of his destiny. Diana had watched the institution of the monarchy from the inside, not from the comfortable, protected distance of someone who observed it through official channels, but from within its daily operations, its internal pressures, its private demands. She had felt what it asked of the people who belonged to it. She had seen how it shaped and sometimes diminished the individuals who carried its expectations. Her letter to William reflected all of that knowledge. She wrote of the kind of king she hoped he would become, one who led not merely through inherited tradition, but through genuine human connection with the people his reign would serve. She described the pressures she had witnessed and felt, the importance of protecting a core of personal authenticity against the institutional forces that would continuously press him toward performance over sincerity. It was not only a mother's farewell. It was a guide, written by someone who had lived inside the machinery her son would one day be required to operate, and who wanted him to be better prepared for it than she had been. The letter to Prince Harry carried a different warmth, a different urgency. Diana understood her younger son with a precision that only comes from genuine attention. His emotional intensity, his need for reassurance, the particular way his sensitivity made him both deeply human and deeply vulnerable to the specific cruelties of royal life. She wrote to him with directness and tenderness, encouraging him to hold onto his own character even when the institution around him pressed for conformity. She wrote of sincerity as something precious and worth protecting, something that could be lost gradually, without a person even noticing, if they allowed external expectations to slowly replace internal truth. She spoke to him of the pressures she herself had navigated, the moments when she had felt the pull toward simply performing the role assigned to her, and the determination she had found to resist it. Her words to Harry were, in many ways, a transmission of hard-won understanding from a mother who had lived the battle her son would face, written with the hope that he would face it with more armor than she had been given. The letter to Earl Spencer concerned the Spencer family and the question of legacy. Diana trusted her brother with specific thoughts about how she wished her memory to be held and protected, how the story of who she actually was should be preserved against the simplifications and distortions that inevitably gather around public figures after their deaths. Charles Spencer had delivered one of the most remarkable eulogies in modern British history at Diana's funeral in Westminster Abbey, a speech that addressed the royal family directly, pledged the Spencer family's protection of her sons, and announced in plain language that her blood family would ensure her legacy was not managed away from its truth. Diana's letter to him was a continuation of that commitment, written from her own hand, entrusting him with a private version of a mission he had already declared publicly. Beyond these 3 letters, additional sealed envelopes were reportedly found whose intended recipients have not been disclosed. The existence of correspondence beyond the immediate family suggests that Diana's private circle of people she felt she owed lasting words to was wider than has ever been publicly known. Who those letters were written for and what they contain remains protected within the custody of the Spencer family. Alongside the letters, the burial chamber held something else, a collection of documents, written records that Diana had maintained during the years of her marriage and her life within the royal household. She had kept notes on conversations, on agreements, on incidents that troubled or frightened her. She had recorded events from her own perspective with a clear awareness that the official institutional account of those same events would not necessarily reflect what she had seen and experienced. These documents reportedly covered financial arrangements within the palace, details of her marriage and its collapse, specific incidents that had been publicly misrepresented or simply never acknowledged, and safety concerns she had carried through her final years. Diana had written a letter to her butler Paul Burrell in October 1996, 10 months before her death, describing her fear that a fatal accident was being arranged for her car. That letter became public in 2003. The additional materials found in the tomb suggest that this fear was not an isolated expression, but part of a broader, documented pattern of concern that Diana maintained in writing over time. These documents remain in Earl Spencer's custody at Althorpe. Their full contents have not been released. What they will eventually reveal to family members, to historians, or to the wider public depends entirely on decisions that have not yet been made. But their existence, confirmed by those present at the tomb's opening, transforms the understanding of what Diana left behind. The burial chamber on the island in the round oval is not only a final resting place. It is a repository of her own voice, maintained in her own words, preserved in the location she trusted most, waiting for the moment that has now arrived. Princess Diana died on August 31st, 1997. The flowers left outside Kensington Palace in the days after her death stretched for miles. An estimated 2.5 billion people watched her funeral on television. She had been the Princess of Wales, a global humanitarian, the patron of hundreds of charities, the mother of 2 future kings, and one of the most recognized human beings ever to have lived. And for 27 years, she lay in silence on that island, while the world continued to argue about who she really was, what she really experienced, and what the truth of her life inside the royal family actually looked like. The tomb was opened. The letters were found. The documents exist. And the woman who spent her life being observed by the entire world, who rarely had a moment of genuine privacy, who was followed by cameras through her joy and her grief and her most ordinary afternoons, had managed, in the end, to keep the most important things she ever said completely hidden, completely protected, and completely on her own terms, until the moment she had chosen for them to be heard. 27 years later, from within a burial chamber on a private island in Northamptonshire, she is still speaking, not through palace spokespeople, not through authorized biographers, not through anyone else's version of her story. In her own words, in sealed envelopes she placed there herself, addressed to the people she chose, delivered at the moment she decided. The tomb was opened, and what was found inside changed everything.